Welcome back. Now, today's 2025-26 national budget was Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana's first under the government of national unity, one that was predicted to test the resolve of the formation at a time when it's showing some fragility amid rising geopolitical tensions. The politics of how economics. How do we read this budget? Political analyst Daniel Silk and Asanda Ngwasheng join me with their thoughts. Thank you so much for your time, lady and gent. Starting off with you, Asanda, looking at the politics around this for about a few weeks and the compromises that were made in this budget that was tabled today. Would you call this a politically neutral budget?
Well, I don't know if it's political neutral necessarily, but I would say that it shows that within the GNU, there have been some compromises that have been made, because the previous budget, which was rejected, was offering a 2% VAT increase, and this one is only offering a 0.5%, only to reach 16% in about 2027. So there has been some compromise, and I think a lot of negotiations that probably would have gone into this budget, and it sounds like there's also a concerted effort to come across in a more united way than the haphazard communication of the previous budget. So I think there definitely has been some lessons learned, and of course there were always going to be lessons, because this is the first GNU budget of this government of national unity. So it was never going to be the same as previous budgets.
Daniel, what can you say about the alignment of the GNU after this VAT saga?
Yeah, I think this has certainly put strains on the GNU. Of course, a budget can put strains on any coalition government anywhere in the world. And this is, as we've said, it's the first for South Africa. Therefore, I do think that there are strains. There's strains not just about, of course, the proposed VAT increase, which the DA were implacably opposed to, but there are strains about the broader policy implementation strategy for the government. And I think that from the DA perspective, this is essentially their big chance to really differentiate themselves within the GNU. I mean, up until now, they've largely been taking over certain departments, attempting to make them more efficient. But the DA hasn't had the ability to really influence policy or future direction. And this budget really offers them that very important seat at the economic policy table. And I think they're going to push the envelope on this right through the parliamentary process in the next couple of months or so. Remember, this budget is a budget, according to the DA, put forward by the ANC, put forward by 40% of the electorate. And for most of the other opposition parties, by and large, they will oppose a potential VAT increase, along with some other suggestions from the minister. And I think that's going to put substantial strain on the cohesiveness of this proposal, and we might see substantial tweaks as well in the next few months.
That's actually very interesting because, of course, as part of the GNU, all political parties have to work together, but at the same time, they come in with different policy stances, and you do see this kind of competitive streak to it. Asanda, though, with that, as much as they strain on the GNU, this competitiveness, is it good for the South African citizen at the end of the day?
I mean, I think it is good competition. I think it is important that the kind of budget that is tabled has been hashed out, has been considered, and has had opposition to it internally, so that by the time it's tabled externally, a lot of the kind of discussions that will be required have taken place. This does help in terms of generating the idea and the belief that for those who voted for the people who are in the GNU beyond the ANC, that their vote really did matter and that they've had an impact. And I think that's why the DA tried to be first out of the gate, saying that they had rejected the VAT, even though it became clear that they were not the only ones who rejected it. But that was, as has already been said, an attempt to differentiate themselves. But I think, it's despite this GNU and the politics and the tensions around it, what is concerning for me is the fact that we are sitting in a budget that is effectively showing signs of World Bank, IMF type structural adjustment programs. We're seeing increased privatization, lots of talk about public-private partnerships, lots of talk about cutting spending, public spending, particularly in the municipal sector as well as the government sector, looking at reviews there. And so I'm concerned about how this budget is following that trajectory, which is something that has been rejected by many, both within the business world as well as within the development world and civic society, because structural adjustment programs have a tendency of doing a lot of cutting but not actually delivering in terms of the services that are needed by people. And so this is not a budget that's going to make a lot of people happy on all sides of the economy, because there's a lot of budget cuts and there isn't much. While there's infrastructure development and all those good things, there isn't much that is positive that is coming outside of maybe social welfare, who has like a minor increase, which itself, you buy 4 loaves of bread instead of the whatever loaves you were going to buy before. It's not much that it's going to get you.
That's quite interesting. Daniel, who do you think should have been considered more in this budget?
Well, the people of South Africa should have been considered more. Ultimately, the story of South Africa's future success is going to be predicated on economic growth. I mean, we've certainly got a budget that is, I think, redistributive in part, and you've seen how the tax brackets have not been adjusted. You've seen VAT increases. South African taxpayers, whether they are the poor or whether they're the middle classes, are really going to be affected much more dramatically in this budget than perhaps one would have expected. And that's due to the bracket creep on the tax tables and to the increase in VAT. But what this budget simply doesn't do is it doesn't present enough growth-oriented policies. Whether or not the trillion rand that has been allocated to infrastructure, A, comes to fruition, and B, is distributed and accomplished in an efficient, accountable, and relevant manner, that remains to be seen, and we'll only judge that years down the line. So the short answer is that we should have, I think, in this budget, spent a lot more time on trimming the fat in government, on cutting wasteful expenditure that's in government. And I think a lot of the problems in South Africa is cash wasted and funds wasted at local government level, at the inefficiencies in local government in particular. So the broader execution, implementation, policy terrain has not really been affected in any dramatic way by this budget. This budget merely reacts to the shortfall that needed to be covered.
Yeah, it's quite interesting that you say that there weren't enough growth-oriented policies put in there. And of course, we know that South Africa does not operate as an island. It is part of the global ecosystem of economies. In my first panel, someone actually mentioned that the Trumponomics weren't really mentioned in this budget. And I'm wondering, from your point of view, Asanda, if you think that, the Trump policies, Trump geopolitics should have been included more in this budget.
And I think there was a mention, with the announcement that 9,000 health workers have been lost, and that there's going to be a lot that's going to need to be restructured in order to be able to ensure that capacity is not lost because of the loss of the funding. I think, this is a budget, and in essence, it's probably more a state of the nation engagement that would go deeper into the political ramifications and implications of the geopolitics of the US having put us where it's put us at this point. But I think there should have been a little bit more around what the government is actually planning to do to avert us being put, under sanction by the US, what they're planning to do to retain AGOA, because, agriculture is a very big part of South Africa's economy. And so if we lose that US contract, there will be ramifications, and those ramifications will be felt across the GDP. And so although they said they're spending some money on water, for instance, because they want to support the agricultural industry, there wasn't enough said about the potential loss of AGOA and what the government is planning to do to mitigate. And that was surprising to me, because one of the last media briefings that the Minister of Agriculture did, he was talking about how they're looking for alternative potential markets in case America decides to cancel its contract. And that's something that should have been mentioned today, just to allay the fears of people that USAID funding cuts would not be the only distraction point that the US would have given us, and that AGOA itself could still go.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. Daniel, you mentioned earlier the strain within the GNU, and I'm wondering, with all the Trump challenges that we have at this point, where South Africa has been in the firing line of US President Donald Trump, I'm wondering if then this should not be the time, or if this will not be the time that the GNU bands together against external forces.
Well, I think the GNU have their own differences of opinion on the role of the United States in South Africa. And even within the ANC, I would argue that the ANC isn't cohesive at all on their dealings with Donald Trump. The message from the president has been one of caution and responsibility, as he spoke just last night in the question time in Parliament. But that doesn't mean to say that there aren't those very frustrated within the ANC who would like a more sort of hardline retaliatory action against Washington. South Africa, though, is small fry when it comes to the United States economy. We need the US much more than the US needs us. And the problem for us in this budget is that we just don't have any fat on the bones. There's just no additional sovereign wealth fund that South Africa has that could be used should we lose those benefits of AGOA to compensate. The only way we compensate for a loss of funds is to increase VAT and increase taxes. And I think, again, it simply points to the fact that we just don't have sufficient emergency reserves. We've got to dig into some of these contingency reserves that we're doing now, and we did in the last budget last year as well, and that makes us very vulnerable. And I think ultimately the world trade position and the insecurities there will probably make us more vulnerable unless we can make up the difference through other trading partners. And I know South Africa certainly is going to put that as a priority.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your time, Asanda and Daniel, and your insights today on the politics of the budget. My guests, political analyst Daniel Silk and Asanda Ngwasheng.